Frequency analysis is a very common technique used to exploit cryptosystems by examining the statistical patterns in the crypto text, the ciphertext. And it's very, very effective at breaking substitution ciphers, like the Vigenère cipher we were talking about a couple of slides ago. The main reason why they are effective is natural language has very well-known standard patterns. So this graph that you're seeing over here is a standard frequency pattern analysis for English. In English, the most common character you will see is an E, right? The second most common, I think, is a T, and then an A. And this is something that has been studied in some detail, and if you happen to know the domain in which a ciphertext was addressing, you may actually be able to get something that's slightly more effective. For example, medicine, if it was a medical dictionary or lots and lots of medical terms, that might alter some of these frequencies a little bit. Not necessarily a lot, and of course you could do this for letter pairs as well. These are the most common letter pairs. There's TH and then HE, AN, IN, ER, and these frequencies follow some sort of a pattern down the line. So frequency analysis works primarily by just guessing. The most common character that you would see in the ciphertext is probably an E, and then the second most common is probably a T. And you could even correlate this with letter pairs as well, right? If the T is the second most common character, the character that follows that is probably the H, which is somewhere lower in the scale, and so on down the line. So you can use this to break a substitution cipher very, very effectively. Now, this is not effective on one-time pads. It's worth thinking for a moment about why. Normally I would ask the class to ponder this for a moment and then see if you could come up with a good answer, but since we are unable to do that, I will simply allow for you to pause the video and come up with a good rationale as to why is this not effective with one-time pads. The answer is, with a one-time pad, you have a entirely random sequence here, and that eliminates the frequencies that you might have found in the plain text. So if the sequence is entirely randomized, when you do this exclusive OR, it's going to be randomized in the ciphertext. And so it's very difficult to pull off any kind of a frequency analysis with the one-time pad. Now, the problem that I had with the one-time pad is that it can only be used one time, right? So you can think about how frequency analysis comes back into play, meaning if you had 3, 4, 5 applications of a single one-time pad being reused, then you might be able to get back to this frequency analysis, right? And it's worth thinking about how many times would you need to see a one-time pad reused for a particular ciphertext before these frequencies are now detectable all over again. Another useful thought experiment for understanding frequency analysis. So if this is a technique for attacking a cryptanalytic system, right, some kind of an encryption system, what do we want in a good cipher? What do we want in a good encryption system? Well, Shannon has a number of characteristics derived from information theory for good ciphers, for good cryptosystems. First, the amount of secrecy needed needs to determine the amount of labor that's appropriate. All right, so if you have national security secrets, probably you're going to need a ton of labor in any kind of an encryption system that would allow you to protect that secret. So you're willing to spend a lot more effort to protect something that's very, very important that you have to keep it secret. But if it's just a grocery list or something like that, probably don't need all that much secrecy, or at least you're willing to sacrifice some of the convenience or some of the security for more convenience, right? The second characteristic that you're interested in, the set of keys in the enciphering algorithm need to be free of complexity. And this is really critical in terms of used cryptosystems, practical cryptosystems. So complexity is the killer for these things, and the more complex they are, the harder they are to actually implement without problems. So if you can, limit the amount of complexity, especially in the key exchange protocol, to the minimum necessary just to produce the sort of security you need. Number 3, implementation of the process should be as simple as possible, and I think this is a really challenging element. The 2 bold-faced ones here are really challenging to determine in advance. It's very, very hard to get an implementation correct and as simple as possible. There are always going to be bugs, and this is why you have to have experts reviewing source code over and over again to make sure that it's implemented correctly. There's no easy way to test this sort of stuff. And in fact, if your opponent is able to crack it, that's sort of like a test in and of itself. So it's sort of putting yourself in the position of the opponent in order to try and do the testing of the system. Number 4, if there are errors, you don't want them propagating to further corrupt the message. So if you can, limit errors to an individual block or an individual message, but if it becomes a protocol-oriented thing or something that propagates to affect other messages, then you've got a very serious problem. And then number 5, finally, you really want the size of the encrypted text not to be larger than the original message. I know that this is not actually possible if you are only using this polygraphic substitution where you have, homophonic substitution where you have one character in the ciphertext, more than one character in the ciphertext representing a single plain text character. But typically, if you're going to be using homophonic substitution, you will also have polygraphic substitution as a part of the cipher down the road, so that the additional character you have in the ciphertext from this homophonic substitution is actually eaten up by having a separate character in the plain text eliminated by representing more than one character by one ciphertext character. So these are the characteristics of good ciphers. I think this is a good list. The hard parts really are figuring out the amount of secrecy and making sure the implementation is correct. But it's still important to go through this entire checklist if you are actually building a crypto system yourself. Now, that said, most people do not want to build their own crypto systems. Most people want to follow a much simpler checklist than this. And that is these 3 things. Very easy to state and generally hard to assess if you are not an expert. So if you are picking out your own crypto system, make sure it's based on sound mathematics, right? Make sure that you have competent experts in crypto looking at it to make sure that it is actually sound in terms of the implementation and mathematics. And if you can, make sure that it's something that's been in use in industry for a long time. This last one is really the key piece. AES 256-bit encryption has been in use a long, long time. It is still secure, still widely used, widely recommended, and because of that, you can kind of skip all of these characteristics. You don't have to do all that much work to get there, just basing it off of the one that's been in use for the longest period of time and is still recommended.